In the early 19th century, the United States was a nation divided by race, slavery, and conflicting visions of freedom. Millions of enslaved Africans lived under brutal conditions, while a growing number of free Black Americans struggled to survive in a society that denied them equality. It was in this tense and turbulent environment that a controversial idea emerged, one that would eventually shape the birth of an entirely new nation on the West African coast. That idea was colonization, and the organization behind it was the American Colonization Society, known simply as the AC. The ACS was founded in 1816 in Washington, D.C., by an unusual alliance of people with very different motives. Some members were abolitionists who believed free Black Americans would never be treated fairly in the U.S. They argued that racism was so deeply rooted that true equality could only exist elsewhere. To them, Africa represented a place where formerly enslaved people could build new lives, free from oppression. But many other supporters of the ACS had very different intentions. Southern slaveholders backed the colonization plan because they saw free Black Americans as a threat to the institution of slavery. They believed that removing free Black citizens from the country would prevent rebellions, reduce anti-slavery activism, and strengthen their control over enslaved labor. Some politicians also supported colonization as a way to avoid dealing with the growing debate over slavery. By sending free Black people to Africa, they hoped to maintain social order without addressing the injustice at the nation's core. Even among those who claimed to support African Americans, the ACS was shaped by paternalistic ideas. Many white Americans believed that Black people could not integrate into American society. They argued that colonization was for their own good, ignoring the fact that most free Black Americans were born in the United States, spoke English, and had no connection to Africa beyond distant ancestry. Despite these conflicting motives, the ACS quickly gained political and financial support. It attracted influential members, including Presidents James Monroe, James Madison, and later Abraham Lincoln. Churches, philanthropic groups, and local societies raised money to send free Black families to Africa. Pamphlets, speeches, and public campaigns painted colonization as a benevolent project, a solution to racial tension, a pathway to African civilization, and a moral mission to uplift the continent. But the people whose lives were at stake, free Black Americans, were far from unified in their response. Many strongly opposed the ACS. They saw it as an attempt to exile them from the country of their birth. Leaders like Frederick Douglass condemned colonization as unjust, arguing that Black Americans had earned their right to live in the United States through centuries of suffering, labor, and struggle. They believed that colonization was a way to avoid confronting racism rather than addressing it. Others, however, viewed the ACS differently. Some free Black individuals, frustrated by discrimination and limited opportunities, saw the idea of starting anew in Africa as a potential path to dignity and independence. They hoped to build a society where their children could grow up without the constant burden of racism. The ACS appealed to these communities by promising land, freedom, and the chance to help spread Christianity and literacy throughout Africa. By the early 1820s, the ACS had raised enough funds and political backing to turn its vision into reality. The organization purchased a ship and prepared the first voyage to West Africa. The mission was risky. Disease, unfamiliar climates, and conflicts with local populations threatened the settlers' survival. Yet the ACS portrayed the journey as a courageous step toward creating a new homeland for free Black Americans. The early expeditions were incredibly difficult. Many settlers died within months due to disease and harsh conditions. But the ACS was determined to establish a permanent presence on the African coast. After several attempts, ACS agents negotiated land from local chiefs around Cape Mesurado, a region in present-day Liberia. This territory would become the foundation for a settlement named Monrovia, in honor of U.S. President James Monroe, a strong supporter of the colonization movement. What began as a small experiment soon grew into a long-term project. Over the next 4 decades, thousands of free Black Americans, along with some formerly enslaved individuals, migrated to the region with ACS support. They brought American culture, language, and religious practices, shaping the identity of the emerging colony. Churches, schools, and government buildings were constructed in the image of American institutions, creating a unique blend of African roots and American influence. But the deeper question, the origin of the ACS, remained controversial. Was it an act of compassion or an act of control? The answer depended on who was asked. To some, the ACS offered hope. To others, it represented yet another form of oppression. The conflicting motives behind the organization shaped every aspect of its mission and laid the foundation for complex tensions that would define Liberia's early history. The founding of the American Colonization Society marked the beginning of a profound and complicated relationship between the United States and the land that would soon be called Liberia. It set into motion a movement that would influence the destiny of thousands of African Americans and ultimately lead to the creation of the first independent Black republic in Africa. Yet behind this story of nation-building lies a deeper truth, one rooted in the struggle for identity, freedom, and belonging. This chapter marks the start of a journey that spans continents, cultures, and generations. A journey born from hope, conflict, and the enduring question of what it means to be free. In February 1820, a small ship named the Elizabeth left the United States carrying a group of free Black Americans and a few white agents of the American Colonization Society. Their destination, a distant and unfamiliar coastline in West Africa. Their mission, to create a settlement where free Black Americans could build new lives, away from the racism and inequality they faced in the United States. This journey marked the beginning of one of the most significant and controversial migrations in 19th century history, the founding of Liberia. The men and women aboard the early voyages carried with them both hope and uncertainty. Many had never seen Africa. Most were American-born, accustomed to life in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Richmond. Yet they were willing to cross the Atlantic, driven by a mixture of desperation, faith, and the promise of independence. Some saw Africa as a land of opportunity, others viewed it as their ancestral home, but none fully understood what awaited them on the coast of West Africa. When the first group arrived near Sherbro Island, in present-day Sierra Leone, they immediately faced harsh realities. Disease swept through the settlers. Malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical illnesses attacked their bodies with relentless force. Within months, nearly half of the settlers had died. The survivors were weakened, frightened, and uncertain whether their dream could survive. The Axe agents were forced to admit that Sherbro Island was unsuitable for permanent settlement. But despite these early tragedies, the ACS refused to abandon the project. They believed that a foothold on the African coast was still possibly and necessary. In 1821, Axe representatives negotiated with coastal chiefs to secure land on the mainland. After tense discussions, violence, and repeated misunderstandings between cultures, the Axe finally acquired a small strip of land at Cape Mesurado, a natural harbor guarded by a rocky promontory. It was here, in 1822, that the settlers established the settlement that would become Monrovia, named after President James Monroe, a supporter of colonization. Life in the new settlement was anything but easy. The early colonists had to build everything from scratch: homes, storage sheds, defenses, and wells. They faced food shortages, hostile weather, and the constant threat of disease. Local ethnic groups, particularly the Dey and the Gola, were wary of the newcomers. Misunderstandings frequently led to conflict. The settlers struggled to establish peaceful relations while defending themselves from attacks. Yet despite these hardships, the colony slowly began to stabilize. Settlers developed farms along the coast, planted crops, and built basic schools and churches. Many brought skills with them: blacksmithing, carpentry, tailoring, and farming, which helped the small community survive. Still, the colony was dependent on supplies from the United States. Each year, more ships arrived with food, tools, clothing, and new settlers. Monrovia grew into a small, but determined outpost of African American culture in Africa. The settlers carried with them American customs, clothing, and traditions. They wore U.S.-style suits and dresses, built houses with American-style architecture, and created churches modeled after Baptist and Methodist congregations back home. English became the dominant language of the settlement, and American-style schools taught children reading, writing, and Bible study. In many ways, Monrovia resembled a small American town transplanted onto West African soil, but the settlers were not alone. Surrounding the settlement were powerful indigenous communities with rich cultures, traditions, and systems of governance. These groups, Vai, Sepel, Kru, Bassa, Gola, and others, had lived along the coast and inland forests for generations. They engaged in trade, fishing, farming, and diplomacy long before the settlers arrived. Some saw the new colony as a potential trading partner. Others viewed it as an intrusion. The relationship between settlers and indigenous groups would shape Liberia's development for decades to come. Over time, the settlers began expanding their territory through negotiations, purchases, and sometimes military force. The acts encouraged the settlers to establish a government modeled on American ideals: democracy, constitutionalism, and Christian principles. Leaders emerged from among the settlers, often people who had been educated or skilled in the United States. They carried themselves with a sense of mission, believing they were bringing civilization and Christianity to Africa, belief influenced by the paternalistic ideas of the acts. Yet even as they sought to build a new society, the settlers struggled with internal divisions. Some arrived voluntarily. Others were freed by their owners on the condition that they leave the United States. They came from different states, cultures, and religious backgrounds. Some had been enslaved. Others were born free. These differences created tensions. This was not a homogeneous community, but a blend of people with unique stories, hopes, and expectations. Still, the colony endured. By the mid-1820s, despite disease, conflict, and hardship, Monrovia had become a permanent settlement. Ships continued to arrive with new colonists, including families, ministers, teachers, and skilled workers. They built schools, churches, a printing press, and eventually a newspaper called the Liberia Herald. Through these institutions, settlers shaped a narrative of resilience and purpose. The founding of Liberia was unlike any other colonial project in Africa. It was not the creation of a European empire, but the product of a complicated American movement involving race, power, and competing agendas. The settlers who arrived in 1822 were pioneers in every sense, strangers in a land that was simultaneously foreign and ancestral. Their survival depended on determination, faith, and cooperation, even when those values were tested. These early years laid the foundation for what would become the first independent Black republic in Africa. But the challenges were far from over. The struggles of the first voyages, disease, conflict, dependency, and cultural clash would echo through Liberia's history for decades. The story of Liberia's founding is a story of courage and contradiction, hardship and hope. It is the tale of a people seeking freedom in a land they had never seen, carrying the weight of American history across the ocean. Their journey was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold across generations and shape the identity of a nation. The founding of Liberia in the early 1820s was not marked by triumph, but by survival. The settlers who arrived from the United States, free Black families, formerly enslaved men and women, missionaries, and skilled laborers, entered a land rich with possibility but fraught with danger. Disease, conflict, hunger, and isolation became their daily reality. The small settlement at Cape Mesurado teetered between hope and collapse, held together only by determination, faith, and sheer will. From the moment the settlers set foot on West African soil, disease became their greatest enemy. Many had never encountered malaria, yellow fever, or other tropical illnesses. Their bodies had no immunity to the pathogens thriving in the humid climate. Within weeks of the first landings, fever tore through the community. Families who had crossed the Atlantic in search of new beginnings now buried loved ones in makeshift graves, often marking the resting places with simple wooden crosses. Entire groups of settlers were wiped out within months. The death toll was devastating. Some historians estimate that more than a quarter of the earliest colonists died during the first year alone. The American Colonization Society had not prepared the settlers for the harsh tropical environment. Supplies were inadequate. Medical knowledge was limited. Many colonists had expected a fresh start. Instead, they found themselves fighting for their lives. But disease was only one challenge. The settlers also faced conflict, not because they sought war, but because misunderstandings and cultural differences created friction with local ethnic groups. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Day, Gola, Kru, Valle, Bassa, and others, had long established political and economic systems. They controlled trade routes, fishing grounds, and farmlands. When settlers purchased land from some local chiefs, other groups disputed the agreements, arguing that no single chief had the authority to sell large territories. These tensions erupted into clashes. Several early attacks on the settlement tested the settlers' ability to defend themselves. The colonists hastily built fortifications, dug defensive trenches, and armed themselves with whatever weapons they had brought from the United States. Some settlers had military experience. Many did not, but survival required unity. Men stood guard at night, while women and children sheltered behind barricades. One of the most dramatic confrontations occurred in 1822, when a coalition of local warriors launched a major assault on the settlement. Outnumbered and exhausted, the settlers fought ferociously. At a desperate moment, an axe agent, Lieutenant Robert Stockton, led a counterattack that drove the attackers away. The settlers survived, but the battle left deep scars, both physical and emotional. It taught the colonists that their survival depended on diplomacy as much as defense. As conflict simmered, hunger became another threat. Many settlers were unfamiliar with West African farming methods. The crops they brought from the United States struggled in the tropical soil. Supplies from America were often delayed or insufficient. The settlers relied heavily on trade with local communities, exchanging tools, clothing, and manufactured goods for rice, fish, cassava, and palm oil. This trade helped stabilize relationships, but shortages remained constant. The axe, sitting thousands of miles away, underestimated just how fragile the settlement was. They sent new settlers, but not enough doctors or trained leaders. The colonists had to depend on each other. Women played crucial roles cooking, nursing, raising children, and maintaining order during times of crisis. Churches became centers of hope. Ministers preached sermons about perseverance, courage, and God's purpose. Faith became a source of emotional strength when physical survival felt impossible. Despite the hardships, the settlers showed remarkable resilience. They learned from their mistakes. They adjusted their farming techniques, adopting local methods, such as planting cassava, and using the climate to their advantage. They built sturdier homes, dug wells, and organized community labor. Over time, they developed a better understanding of the environment and built relationships with neighboring chiefs who recognized the benefits of peaceful coexistence. As Monrovia grew, the settlers established schools to teach literacy and Bible study. Children who survived the early years became the colony's future leaders. The settlers built small businesses, such as blacksmith shops, carpentry workshops, and trading posts. Each step forward, no matter how small, was the result of incredible effort. Yet the colony remained vulnerable. Disease continued to claim lives. Conflict with indigenous groups flared intermittently. The settlers were vastly outnumbered by the local population, and cultural misunderstandings persisted. Still, the colony endured. Each struggle forged a stronger sense of identity among the settlers. They began calling themselves Americo-Liberians, reflecting their American heritage and their new African home. The hardships of these early years shaped the political and social structure of the colony. Leaders emerged from among the settlers, individuals who could negotiate with local chiefs, organize community defenses, and maintain order. These leaders often came from those who had received some education or military experience in the United States. Their leadership style was influenced by American institutions, laws, and traditions, laying the groundwork for a government that resembled the United States more than the neighboring African societies. But the settlers' survival had also come at a cost. The early conflicts, cultural misunderstandings, and unequal power dynamics planted the seeds of future tensions between Americo-Liberians and indigenous populations. These tensions would shape Liberia's political landscape for generations. Still, in the 1820s, survival was victory enough. Against overwhelming odds, the settlers carved out a foothold on the West African coast. They endured disease, hunger, conflict, and despair. Their resilience allowed the fragile settlement to grow into a permanent colony. What had begun as an experiment was becoming a reality in new society, shaped by the struggle to stay alive. The story of Liberia's early years is a story of courage born from suffering, determination forged in hardship, and identity built on survival. These settlers, fragile yet resolute, laid the foundation of a nation that would one day stand as Africa's first independent Black republic. As the fragile colony at Cape Mesurado struggled through its early years of disease, conflict, and scarcity, one place gradually emerged as its beating heart: Monrovia. Perched on a rocky headland overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, the settlement became the political, cultural, and spiritual center of the new colonial, American-rooted community, rising on African soil. But Monrovia was more than a town. It was a symbol of identity, ambition, and the growing influence of the United States in West Africa. The settlers who had survived the brutal first years began to rebuild their lives with deliberate focus. They constructed sturdier homes using timber and local materials, replacing the temporary shelters they had hastily erected upon arrival. Narrow dirt roads wound between the houses, leading to small plots of farmland, trading posts, and community gathering spots. Although modest, Monrovia stood as a testament to resilience. It reminded the settlers of their sacrifices, their endurance, and their shared belief that this land could become a permanent home. The layout and culture of Monrovia reflected the American backgrounds of its inhabitants. Homes were designed with front porches, pitched roofs, and rectangular windows, resembling the architecture of the mid-Atlantic United States. Churches formed the backbone of daily life, hosting services, community meetings, and schools. Ministers played a central role in shaping the colony's moral direction, offering guidance through sermons and education. The settlers' strong Christian identity became a defining feature of the town. Education held a special place in Monrovia's development. The settlers believed literacy and learning were essential for building a stable society. As soon as the community could spare the resources, they established schools for children and adults. These institutions taught reading, writing, mathematics, and Bible study. They also trained future leaders, young men and women, who would later serve as teachers, diplomats, pastors, and officials. One of the most important developments of this period was the creation of a printing press. With it came the colony's first newspaper, the Liberia Herald. Founded in 1826, the paper allowed settlers to communicate ideas, share news, and shape public opinion within the colony. It also served as a link between Liberia and the wider world, announcing developments to supporters in the United States. The press gave Monrovia a voice, enabling the community to articulate its goals, struggles, and growing identity. But American influence did not stop at culture or education. The American Colonization Society remained deeply involved in the colony's affairs. While the settlers increasingly handled day-to-day governance, the acts controlled funding, supplies, and major decisions. The society selected governors, appointed advisors, and monitored the colony's development from Washington, D.C. The relationship was complex. On one hand, the settlers relied on ACS support for survival. On the other, they resented the paternalistic oversight, believing it undermined their independence. The acts promoted American-style political institutions, encouraging the development of courts, councils, and local laws modeled after those in the United States. The settlers embraced many of these structures, seeing them as familiar and effective. They believed these institutions would help establish order, justice, and legitimacy. The result was a unique blend of African environment and American governance, an experiment that had never been attempted before on the continent. Yet Monrovia did not exist in isolation. Surrounding the settlement were indigenous groups with their own traditions, systems of governance, and social hierarchies. As Monrovia expanded, interactions with these groups increased through trade, treaties, and sometimes conflict. The settlers traded manufactured goods, tools, and cloth in exchange for rice, livestock, and palm oil. These exchanges helped stabilize relations and provided essential supplies for the colony. Still, misunderstandings often arose. The settlers saw themselves as bringing civilization and Christianity, while indigenous communities viewed them as outsiders with unfamiliar customs. Both sides struggled to fully understand each other's intentions. This dynamic shaped the colony's early diplomacy, forcing settlers to develop skills in negotiation, cultural sensitivity, and conflict management. Despite tensions, Monrovia grew steadily. New settlers arrived each year from the United States, families seeking opportunity, individuals freed from slavery, and sometimes children sent by church groups, hoping to give them new lives. With each arrival, Monrovia expanded outward, forming new neighborhoods and small satellite villages. The population became more diverse, but American customs remained dominant. Within a few decades, Monrovia developed the characteristics of a true capital. It hosted administrative offices, community centers, and churches that doubled as meeting halls. Leaders emerged from among the settlers, individuals who possessed education, charisma, or experience in governance. These leaders began shaping policies, representing the colony in negotiations, and promoting visions for Liberia's future. American missionaries also played an influential role. They established churches, schools, and training institutes aimed at spreading Christian education throughout the region. Their presence reinforced the colony's American identity, but it also deepened tensions with indigenous groups who felt their traditions were being challenged. Yet missionaries believed their mission brought progress, literacy, and new opportunities. By the mid-19th century, the ACS's influence remained strong, but settlers increasingly asserted their independence. They wanted a society not merely shaped by American ideals, but governed by people who understood the land, the culture, and the challenges of daily life in West Africa. This growing confidence laid the groundwork for a profound political shift that would reshape Monrovia and the entire colony. What began as a fragile settlement had become a thriving, self-aware community, a city balancing African realities with American heritage. Monrovia's formation marked the beginning of a national identity rooted in resilience and shaped by the settlers' experience of survival and adaptation. As the population grew and the colony strengthened, the settlers moved closer to a bold, unprecedented step: the creation of an independent republic on African soil. Liberia's foundations were laid in Monrovia, in its churches, its schools, its government buildings, and its people. These foundations would soon support a new nation, one that would make history as the first independent black republic in Africa. As Monrovia slowly took shape along the West African coast, the settlers who had crossed the Atlantic found themselves surrounded by powerful indigenous nations whose histories stretched back centuries. The land they now occupied was not empty. It belonged to complex societies with their own traditions, beliefs, and political structures. The early relationship between the settlers and these communities would determine the colony's survival, identity, and future. It would become one of the most defining and most complicated chapters in Liberia's early history. When the first groups of African American settlers arrived in the 1820s, they encountered a landscape governed by various ethnic groups: the Day and Gola, near the coast; the Bassa and Kru, further along the shoreline; and the Valle Sapel, and others inland. These groups had well-established systems of governance based on councils of elders, clan networks, and spiritual leaders. They practiced agriculture, fishing, weaving, and long-distance trade. The settlers were not entering a wilderness, they were entering a region rich with political and cultural life. At first, the settlers tried to establish peaceful relations. They depended heavily on local communities for food, water, and knowledge of the land. Indigenous traders provided rice, cassava, palm oil, and livestock. Settlers offered in return cloth, metal tools, weapons, and manufactured goods from the United States. These exchanges built early trust, and some chiefs saw the settlers as valuable trading partners who could expand their access to foreign goods. But below the surface, misunderstandings grew. The settlers brought with them American cultural norms, Christian beliefs, and Western legal concepts. Indigenous groups followed their own customary laws, often based on communal ownership of land and ancestral rights. When the settlers purchased land using treaties drafted in English and based on American concepts of private property, many African chiefs believed they were entering into temporary agreements, shared usage, friendship, and mutual obligation. The settlers, however, believed they had secured permanent sovereignty over those territories. These different interpretations laid the groundwork for early conflicts. As Monrovia expanded, settlers pushed outward to secure more farmland and trading routes. Indigenous communities, feeling pressured, resisted. Several clashes erupted throughout the 1820s and 1830s. In some cases, it was the settlers who fired first. In others, indigenous warriors attacked in retaliation for perceived violations of agreements. Each conflict left lasting scars, deepening distrust between the two worlds. Yet conflict was not the only story. There were also alliances, fragile, shifting, but deeply significant. Many chiefs recognized the advantages of partnering with the settlers. Some sought their military support against rival groups. Others valued access to American trade goods. Over time, networks of diplomacy formed. Chiefs and settlers negotiated treaties, marriage alliances, and trade agreements. These relationships helped stabilize the colony and gave the settlers the breathing room they needed to survive. Missionaries played a major role in shaping relations with indigenous groups. They traveled into villages, preaching Christianity, teaching literacy, and establishing schools. Some were welcomed, others were viewed with suspicion. While missionaries believed they were bringing spiritual salvation, many indigenous leaders saw their presence as an attempt to replace traditional beliefs. The encounter between Christianity and indigenous spirituality created cultural tension that would last for generations. One of the most significant forms of tension emerged from the settlers' attitudes. Many settlers, influenced by American values and the beliefs promoted by the Acts, viewed indigenous Africans as uncivilized or in need of guidance. This mindset reflected the same racial and cultural prejudices the settlers had themselves endured in the United States. Ironically, some settlers replicated the very hierarchies they had hoped to escape. Indigenous peoples noticed this. They observed the settlers' political structures, formal courts, elected councils, and written laws, and recognized that a different system of power was taking root. This new system challenged traditional authority, undermining the influence of chiefs and elders. Some chiefs feared losing their land, their sovereignty, and their cultural identity. Still, the relationships between settlers and indigenous groups were not fixed. They evolved constantly, shaped by personalities, circumstances, and the pressures of survival. Some chiefs became strong allies of the settlers, trading regularly and even converting to Christianity. Others resisted foreign influence fiercely, defending their communities through armed resistance. In many cases, the settlers relied on diplomacy as much as on force, negotiating treaties that expanded their territory while trying to avoid open war. By the mid-19th century, the settlers had established political control over a growing stretch of coastline. Through treaties, sometimes peaceful, sometimes contested, they extended their authority across dozens of miles. Monrovia became the center of a new political order, one that blended American institutions with African realities. But this expansion deepened the divide between the settlers and indigenous groups. The settlers, now calling themselves Americo-Liberians, increasingly saw themselves as the rightful rulers of the region. They believed they were building a republic based on American values, democracy, Christianity, and commerce. Indigenous groups, however, viewed the settlers as newcomers who had taken land, imposed foreign laws, and disrupted traditional ways of life. Despite the tension, cooperation never disappeared entirely. Trade between settlers and indigenous communities remained vital. Rice, palm oil, and livestock flowed into Monrovia, while cloth, tools, and firearms flowed out to inland markets. Interactions in daily life continued: shared markets, shared rivers, shared boundaries. These exchanges softened the edges of conflict and kept the two societies intertwined. By the time Liberia moved toward independence in the 1840s, relations had settled into a fragile balance. Indigenous communities recognized that the settlers were there to stay. Settlers understood they could not survive without indigenous cooperation. Both sides learned, sometimes painfully, that coexistence was the only path forward. Yet the divide between Americo-Liberians and indigenous peoples never faded. It shaped politics, society, and identity. It influenced how Liberia saw itself and how it was seen by the rest of Africa. The early struggles for understanding and respect would become central to the nation's future, influencing everything from governance to social structure. The relationships forged in these early decades were complex and contradictory, marked by fear and friendship, conflict and cooperation. They formed the foundation for a nation unlike any other, a country built by African Americans, rooted in American culture, but deeply connected to the indigenous peoples whose land became Liberia's home. As the colony in Liberia grew throughout the 1830s and 1840s, a major shift began to unfold, one that would slowly weaken the influence of the American Colonization Society acts and open the door for Liberians to govern themselves. The early years of the colony had depended almost entirely on the acts for leadership, supplies, and direction. But the settlers' growing confidence, experience, and desire for autonomy gradually transformed the political landscape. What began as a project controlled from Washington, D.C., evolved into a self-governing community shaped by its own leaders, struggles, and aspirations. In the early decades, the ACS dictated nearly every major decision in the colony. It appointed governors, supervised finances, controlled trade, and determined how land would be distributed. But this system was difficult to sustain. The ACS was a private organization, not a government hand. It was stretched thin by the enormous costs of running a colony across the Atlantic. Ships, medicine, tools, salaries, missionary support, military defense, all of it required money, and donations from the United States were inconsistent. Many supporters of the ACS believed the colonization project was benevolent, but enthusiasm faded as the realities of disease, death, and conflict in Liberia became widely known. Political pressure also grew in the United States. Abolitionists condemned the ACS, arguing that colonization was an attempt to avoid confronting slavery. Others questioned why American taxpayers should support a distant colony. The anti-slavery movement gained momentum throughout the 1830s and 1840s, shifting national attention away from colonization and toward the urgent struggle to end slavery itself. As the American Civil War approached, the ACS became increasingly irrelevant in American politics. Meanwhile, the settlers in Liberia were becoming more capable and more united. They had survived the terrible early years. They had built Monrovia into a functioning community, with churches, schools, courts, and councils. They had developed political experience, negotiating treaties, managing conflicts, and running local infrastructure. They had formed their own identity as Americo-Liberians, blending American culture with African realities. With each passing year, they felt less like temporary colonists and more like the founders of a new nation. This growing confidence led to a powerful desire for self-rule. Local leaders began pushing the axe to relinquish control. They argued that those who lived in Liberia understood its needs far better than distant managers in the United States. They believed that the settlers had earned the right to govern themselves through their sacrifices and achievements. Politically and emotionally, the idea of independence was becoming unavoidable. The axe, weakened by financial troubles and growing criticism, gradually ceded more authority. The settlers gained control over local courts, taxation, and community affairs. They elected delegates to councils and assemblies, shaping laws and policies that reflected the colony's realities. The act still appointed governors, but the balance of power was shifting. One of the most influential figures in this transition was Joseph Jenkins Roberts, an Americo-Liberian merchant who had emigrated from Virginia as a young man. Intelligent, diplomatic, and respected, Roberts rose through the ranks of local leadership. In 1841, he became the first black colonial governor of Liberia, replacing white axe administrators. His leadership marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Roberts believed deeply in self-government and worked tirelessly to prepare the colony for independence. Under Roberts and other local leaders, Liberia expanded its territory through treaties and negotiations. It strengthened its defense forces and increased its trade with European nations. It improved its legal system and organized its economy. The settlers began to envision Liberia not as a colony, but as a sovereign republic that could speak for itself on the world stage. As Liberia grew stronger, the ACS faded further into the background. Donations declined. Membership dropped. The organization struggled to maintain its influence. It had once controlled every aspect of the colony, but by the mid-1840s, it had become more of an advisor than a ruler. The settlers were running their own courts, managing their own trade, and building their own institutions. What remained was a symbolic connection, rather than practical control. In the United States, the ACS faced growing hostility from both sides of the slavery debate. Pro-slavery advocates believed the ACS was helping free black people escape the institution they depended on. Abolitionists believed the ACS was a racist organization, trying to remove free black Americans from their homeland. With the nation becoming increasingly polarized, colonization was no longer a unifying idea, it was a political burden. The settlers in Liberia recognized this shift. They saw that the time had come to take full control. Their desire for self-rule was not only political but emotional. They wanted to shape their own destiny, write their own laws, and establish their own identity. The colony's success and its survival depended on the settlers believing in themselves as a nation. By the mid-1840s, the acts quietly acknowledged that the colony no longer needed direct oversight. The settlers were capable. The leadership was strong. The population had grown. Liberia had developed the administrative, diplomatic, and economic foundations necessary for a functioning state. While the act still provided support, it no longer dictated policy. What had begun as a project of white American philanthropists, missionaries, and politicians was now something different, something owned by the settlers who had survived disease, conflict, hunger, and isolation to build a new society. The dream of independence was becoming a reality, and the decline of the ACS was the final step toward that new beginning. The rise of self-governance in Liberia was not just a political transformation, it was a story of resilience, pride, and determination. The settlers had taken control of their future. The axe, once powerful and paternalistic, had become a fading presence. And a new chapter was beginning, one that would lead to the birth of the first independent black republic in Africa. By the mid-1840s, the colony in Liberia had reached a turning point. After decades of hardship, the settlers had built a functioning society, one with schools, churches, a legal system, trade networks, and a growing sense of identity. They were no longer a fragile outpost, struggling to survive, but a confident community, ready to stand on its own. The decline of the American Colonization Society's influence opened the door to a historic moment. The settlers began to ask a bold and profound question. Should Liberia become an independent nation? The idea of independence was not new. From the earliest years of the colony, the settlers had dreamed of full self-rule. They wanted freedom from ACS oversight and the ability to govern their own affairs. But declaring independence was not a simple decision. Liberia was surrounded by African kingdoms, European trading posts, and emerging colonial ambitions. The settlers had to consider whether they were strong enough, politically, militarily, and economically to stand as a sovereign state. Yet the desire for independence grew stronger as the settlers developed their own institutions. Leaders such as Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Beverly Wilson, Elijah Johnson, and Hilary Teague believed the colony had matured enough to govern itself. Roberts, who served as governor after being appointed by the ACS, had demonstrated wisdom, diplomacy, and leadership. He was trusted by both the settlers and foreign traders. Under his guidance, Liberia negotiated treaties, expanded its territory, and advanced its trade with Europe and the United States. The moment to declare independence came into focus in 1846, when the ACS formally encouraged the settlers to consider forming their own nation. The society, weakened and increasingly unable to manage the colony, knew it could no longer maintain direct control. For the settlers, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. They formed a constitutional convention, a gathering of delegates, elected to represent different settlements and communities across the colony. The convention met in Monrovia, where delegates debated the structure of the new government. They examined constitutions from around the world, but it was the United States Constitution that influenced them most. The settlers admired its framework of checks and balances, its emphasis on individual liberties, and its democratic ideals. After all, the settlers themselves had grown up in the United States, or under American influence. They were familiar with American political culture, and they sought to replicate the principles they believed embodied freedom and opportunity. The resulting document, the Liberian Constitution of 1847, was one of Africa's earliest modern constitutions. It established a republic with three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. It granted citizenship and civil rights to Americo-Liberians and established a system of elections. It also emphasized Christianity and education as essential foundations of national life. The Constitution reflected both the settlers' American heritage and their hopes for a stable, prosperous nation. But the delegates also made choices that would have long-lasting consequences. Citizenship was largely restricted to people of African descent, not Europeans, not white Americans, and not indigenous Africans living outside the settler communities. This was partly a response to centuries of white domination, but it also reflected the settlers' desire to maintain political control. Their fear of losing authority shaped the structure of the new republic in ways that would influence Liberia's social and political tensions for generations. On July 26, 1847, Liberia formally declared its independence, becoming the first independent black republic in Africa, and the second independent republic on the continent after Haiti. The proclamation was met with celebration throughout Monrovia. Church bells rang, crowds gathered in the streets, and prayer services marked the occasion. A wave of pride washed through the settler community. They had achieved something unprecedented, building a sovereign nation in the face of unimaginable challenges. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a respected leader and diplomat, was elected as Liberia's first president. His inauguration marked a new chapter in the nation's story. Roberts immediately set to work securing international recognition. This was crucial. Without recognition, Liberia could not trade freely or protect its borders from European powers, who were rapidly expanding across Africa. The United Kingdom was the first major power to recognize Liberia in 1848, followed by France, Portugal, and Brazil. These recognitions helped legitimize Liberia's status in the eyes of the world. But the United States, the settlers' former homeland, hesitated. The issue of Liberia's recognition was entangled in America's internal struggle over slavery. Many U.S. politicians feared that recognizing an independent black republic would empower abolitionists and challenge the ideology of white supremacy. For years, Liberia existed as an independent nation without the formal recognition of the United States. It was not until 1864, during the Civil War and under President Abraham Lincoln, that the U.S. finally recognized Liberia's sovereignty. This delay highlighted the racial politics that had shaped both nations' histories. As Liberia took its first steps as a republic, it faced enormous challenges. The new nation was small, its population limited, and its resources stretched. Indigenous groups vastly outnumbered the settlers, yet they were not fully integrated into the political system. European powers eyed West Africa with growing interest. Internal divisions simmered among the settlers themselves, based on class, origin, and religion. But despite these obstacles, independence represented hope. It represented self-determination. It represented the belief that African-descended people could build a nation grounded in liberty, education, and Christianity. The pioneers of Liberia saw themselves as custodians of a grand experiment, one that blended American ideals with African reality. The birth of the Republic marked the beginning of a new era. The settlers were no longer colonists under a CS authority. They were citizens of their own nation. They were free to shape laws, govern land, and chart a future based on their values and vision. Independence gave Liberia the dignity and sovereignty its founders had long sought, a dignity they believed had been denied to them in the United States. Liberia's declaration of independence was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a complex, often turbulent journey. But in 1847, the settlers stood proudly on the shores of West Africa, raising the flag of a nation they had carved out through perseverance and sacrifice. They believed they were building a beacon of freedom and example for Africa and for the world. When Liberia declared its independence in 1847, the settlers who had built the colony stepped into a new role, not just as survivors or pioneers, but as the political elite of a sovereign republic. These African-American descended settlers, now known as Americo-Liberians, saw themselves as leaders of a grand experiment, a self-governing black nation built on American ideals, Christian principles, and Western law. Yet the system they created, while inspired by their own struggle for dignity, soon produced deep social divisions that would shape Liberia's identity and politics for generations. The Americo-Liberians made up only a small fraction of the population. They numbered just a few thousand people, while the indigenous communities, Pelbasa, Kru, Vai, Gola, Loma, and many others numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Yet political power rested almost entirely in the hands of the settlers. Their constitution replicated American structures of democracy. But in practice, political participation was limited mostly to the Americo-Liberian elite. They controlled the presidency, the legislature, the courts, the military, and most economic opportunities. This imbalance created a system that resembled the United States of the early 1800s, with a privileged minority governing a much larger population. To the settlers, this structure felt natural. Many had grown up in a society where elites dominated politics. They believed they had the education, religious background, and administrative experience needed to run a modern republic. And after surviving the hardships of colonization, they felt that they had earned the right to lead. But for Liberia's indigenous communities, the system felt imposed. They had not participated in writing the constitution. They had not been represented in the political councils. Many lived under their own traditional political systems, governed by chiefs and councils of elders. They did not always see the Americo-Liberians as fellow Africans. They saw them as outsiders with foreign customs, foreign clothing, foreign religion, and foreign ideas about land ownership. The Americo-Liberians' culture deepened this divide. They dressed in Western suits and Victorian-style dresses. They built homes resembling American plantations, complete with large porches and classical columns. They spoke English, attended mission-run schools, and practiced Christianity. They held formal dinners, community meetings, and church services that mirrored those of middle-class Americans. Their culture set them apart, not just socially, but symbolically. The Americo-Liberians believed it was their mission to civilize the interior of Liberia. They saw themselves as bearers of progress, bringing Christianity, literacy, and modern governance. But this belief carried a harsh truth. It implied that indigenous Africans were somehow inferior or behind. This attitude, born from the racial ideology of the United States, shaped Americo-Liberian policy. Indigenous communities were governed indirectly, taxed without full rights, and sometimes forced into labor for public works. This created a paradox. The settlers had come to Africa seeking freedom from oppression, yet they created structures that marginalized others. They had fled a society that treated them as outsiders, yet they became outsiders within the land they now governed. The irony was profound and painful, and it formed the core of Liberia's social tensions. Land posed one of the greatest sources of conflict. Indigenous groups followed customary land ownership, based on family or clan lineage. Land was communal, not something to be sold permanently. But the Americo-Liberians followed the American model of private land deeds. When they expanded settlements or established towns, they often claimed land through treaties, whose meanings were misunderstood by local chiefs. These disputes sometimes led to violence, reinforcing the divide between the settlers and the original inhabitants. Despite these tensions, Liberia did not descend into constant conflict. Trade connected settlers and indigenous groups. Some indigenous leaders formed alliances with Americo-Liberians, benefiting from access to Western goods, missionaries, and political protection. Over time, indigenous children attended mission schools, learned English, and even joined the government or military. Social boundaries existed, but they were not absolute. Still, the Americo-Liberian elite maintained firm control through the True Whig Party, which dominated Liberian politics for more than a century. The party became synonymous with authority. Elections were held, but power rarely changed hands. The same families held office generation after generation, creating a political aristocracy built on settler heritage. In Monrovia, life revolved around churches, schools, Masonic lodges, and political societies. Education became a marker of class. Those who attended Western schools gained advantages in government and business. Those who did not, mostly indigenous Liberians, remained at a disadvantage. The settlers saw themselves as guardians of a modern nation, but their grip on power kept Liberia from becoming a fully inclusive democracy. This social divide was visible in daily life. In many towns, Americo-Liberians lived in coastal settlements, while indigenous communities lived inland. The economy reflected this gap as well. Wealth flowed through Americo-Liberian merchants, who controlled trade with Europe and the United States, while indigenous farmers worked the land with limited access to modern markets. Missionaries attempted to bridge the divide, but their efforts were not enough to overcome structural inequalities. Yet Liberia was not simply divided, was evolving. As the 19th century progressed, more indigenous people entered the settler-dominated system. Some served as soldiers, traders, diplomats, or plantation workers. Some converted to Christianity. Some attended schools and became literate. The boundary between the two worlds remained, but it became more porous over time. In this complex society, Americo-Liberians saw themselves as builders of a black republican alternative to colonial rule. To them, Liberia was proof that people of African descent could govern themselves with dignity and intelligence. They saw their mission as elevating the nation. But the cost of this mission was the creation of a social hierarchy that excluded many of the very people the republic sought to represent. As the decades passed, the world around Liberia changed. European powers carved Africa into colonies. Indigenous groups across the continent resisted foreign rule. Liberia, the only independent black republic in Africa, stood as a symbol of sovereignty, but also as a reminder of the unfinished journey toward equality within its own borders. The Americo-Liberian era shaped Liberia's identity, its triumphs, and its struggles. It created the political foundations of the republic, but also the social tensions that would echo long into the 20th century. Liberia's story was never just one of settlers or indigenous groups alone. It was the story of a nation trying to unite two worlds into one. As Liberia entered the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the young republic faced a new set of challenges not of survival or political formation, but of economic reality. Independence had brought pride and legitimacy, but it had not brought prosperity. The nation struggled to sustain itself financially, relying heavily on foreign support, trade, and investment. And as the decades passed, one country became the dominant external force shaping Liberia's economic future: the United States. Liberia's economy was built on small-scale agriculture, coastal trade, and modest exports. Coffee, palm oil, ivory, and later rubber formed the core of its commerce. But these industries were unstable. Prices fluctuated, markets shifted, and competition grew. Unlike many African regions colonized by European powers, Liberia lacked large-scale investment in infrastructure, such as railroads, ports, or factories. Without these, the nation struggled to expand its economy beyond basic exports. The Americo-Liberian elite controlled much of the trade. Merchants in Monrovia managed shipping routes and negotiated with foreign traders, but profits remained limited. Liberia's geography added to the difficulties. Much of the land was covered in dense forest, making inland transportation difficult. Roads were poor, and travel between coastal towns and interior communities could take days or even weeks. Meanwhile, other African regions under European colonial rule saw rapid infrastructure development. Railways, telegraph lines, and shipping ports transformed trade. Liberia, standing alone as the only independent black republic in Africa, lacked the financial resources to undertake similar projects. And because it sought to maintain its independence, it hesitated to invite too much foreign influence. It had no other means to build a stronger economy. This tension created a cycle of dependency. The United States, which had played a central role in Liberia's founding, gradually became Liberia's primary economic partner. American church groups built schools and missions. American traders became key buyers of Liberian goods, and American diplomats saw Liberia as a symbol of U.S. influence in Africa, especially during an era when European powers dominated the continent. One of the most defining moments in this relationship came in the early 20th century, when Firestone Rubber Company entered Liberia. Rubber had become one of the most valuable commodities in the world, essential for car tires in a rapidly industrializing era. Firestone sought a reliable source of rubber outside British and Dutch colonial territories, and Liberia, independent, uncolonized, and eager for investment, appeared ideal. In 1926, Firestone secured a 99-year lease for 1 million acres of land to establish the world's largest rubber plantation. This deal brought money, jobs, and infrastructure to Liberia. Roads were built, schools and clinics appeared. Thousands of Liberians found work on the plantations, gaining steady wages. On the surface, it looked like the beginning of economic revival, but the arrangement came with consequences. Firestone gained immense influence over Liberia's economy. The government became increasingly dependent on loans connected to the rubber industry. This gave the United States, through Firestone, and later through diplomatic channels, significant leverage over Liberia's internal affairs. Critics argued that Liberia had traded political independence for economic dependence. The nation remained free from colonial rule, yet foreign corporations shaped much of its economic destiny. The financial challenges continued. Liberia struggled to pay its debts, maintain infrastructure, and expand industry. Trade remained limited, and the government often relied on loans from the U.S. to stay afloat. These loans came with conditions that gave American officials increasing oversight over Liberia's finances. In the 1920s and 1930s, American advisors held major roles in the Liberian government, guiding budget decisions and economic policy. For many Liberians, this felt like a new form of foreign control. They questioned whether independence had truly protected them from external domination. While the U.S. never formally colonized Liberia, its influence reached deep into the nation's political and economic structures. Every major financial decision, every budget crisis, and every attempt to expand industry was tied in some way to American interests. Yet it would be unfair to portray this relationship as solely exploitative. American involvement also brought opportunities. Mission schools produced educated Liberian leaders. Medical missions introduced modern healthcare. Trade with the U.S. gave Liberia access to global markets. Many Americo-Liberians embraced the U.S. connection, seeing it as a lifeline in a challenging region dominated by European powers. But the imbalance of power was undeniable. Liberia relied on the United States far more than the United States relied on Liberia. This created a dynamic of dependence that shaped Liberia's foreign policy, economy, and even its internal politics. At times, Liberian leaders felt compelled to align with American interests to secure loans, protect trade, or maintain international recognition. As Liberia entered the early 20th century, this dependency became increasingly visible. European colonial expansion intensified around it. France, Britain, and Germany exerted pressure on Liberia's borders, seeking territorial concessions. The United States, while supportive, often acted cautiously, balancing humanitarian sympathy, corporate interests, and geopolitical strategy. Liberia stood alone as an independent nation in a colonized continent, but its independence came with vulnerability. The settlers' dream of building a self-sufficient, thriving Black republic confronted the realities of global economics and limited resources. The tension between sovereignty and survival defined much of Liberia's early history. Economic dependence on foreign powers, especially the United States, became a central theme that shaped Liberia's identity and challenges. It raised questions that remain relevant today. How does a small nation maintain independence in a world dominated by larger powers? How can sovereignty be preserved when the economy depends on external support? And what does freedom mean when it exists alongside financial vulnerability? The answers to these questions would unfold in Liberia's future. But in the early 20th century, one thing was clear. The nation that had begun as an experiment in freedom was now navigating a world where independence was both a blessing and a burden, shaped by the forces of global power and the complexities of its own internal divisions. As Liberia stepped into the early 20th century, the only independent Black republic in a continent carved up by European empires, carried with it a complex legacy. The nation owed its existence to African American settlers who had crossed the ocean in search of freedom. It owed its political foundations to the American system that shaped its constitution and early governance. And it owed much of its survival to the economic and diplomatic support, and sometimes pressure, of the United States. This layered relationship, part partnership, part dependency, part aspiration, became the central theme of Liberia's early modern history. The Americo-Liberian elites saw themselves as the guardians of a republic born from struggle. They viewed Liberia as a symbol of black self-determination in a world dominated by colonialism and racism. In their eyes, Liberia represented everything the United States had denied them: sovereignty, dignity, and nationhood. They believed that the values they brought with them, Christianity, democracy, education, and industry, were the foundation of a modern African state. Yet this vision stood in tension with Liberia's reality. The nation was economically fragile, geographically isolated, and politically divided. The Americo-Liberian leadership clung tightly to power, fearing instability if authority were shared more broadly with the indigenous majority. This choice preserved the political structure of the republic but deepened social divides and limited the nation's ability to unify. Meanwhile, the influence of the United States continued to shape Liberia's direction. American missionaries expanded their work across the country, establishing schools, hospitals, and churches. These missions introduced Western-style education to thousands of Liberians, creating a new generation of indigenous leaders who would one day challenge the dominance of the settler elite. Mission schools, whether Methodist, Baptist, Episcopal, or Presbyterian, produced teachers, pastors, and early administrators who played crucial roles in building the nation. American companies also expanded their reach. The arrival of Firestone Rubber Company in the 1920s transformed Liberia's economy. It brought roads, clinics, and employment. But it also tied the country's economic stability to a single foreign corporation. For the U.S., the investment was a strategic way to secure rubber at a time when global supplies were controlled by European powers. For Liberia, it was a double-edged sword, a path to development, but also a path to deeper financial dependence. Diplomatically, the United States played a complicated role. It saw Liberia as a symbol of American humanitarianism and as a foothold in Africa, but its support was often cautious. While the U.S. admired Liberia's survival and shared historical ties, it hesitated to intervene deeply in its affairs. This ambiguity left Liberia vulnerable when European colonial powers pressed on its borders, and again when internal political and economic crises emerged. Yet despite these challenges, Liberia endured. It remained independent through the colonial era, through world wars, and through the massive political changes sweeping the globe. Its survival alone was extraordinary, a testament to the resilience of its people, both Americo-Liberian and indigenous. Liberia became a voice for African self-rule, long before decolonization swept the continent in the mid-20th century. For many Africans, Liberia represented what was possible, an African flag flying free, long before independence movements gained momentum elsewhere. The early decades of the 20th century also saw the slow beginnings of social transformation within Liberia. More indigenous leaders entered the political structure. Some Americo-Liberians advocated for reforms. Mission-educated men and women emerged as teachers, soldiers, administrators, and entrepreneurs. The lines between settler and indigenous communities, while still present, began to blur as more Liberians participated in national life. These changes did not erase the tensions that had shaped the nation since its founding, but they planted seeds for future evolution. Liberia's identity, part African, part American, and uniquely its own, continued to evolve. It became a crossroads of ideas, traditions, and aspirations. The settlers saw Liberia as the fulfillment of a promise. Indigenous Liberians increasingly saw it as their rightful homeland. Through it all, the legacy of U.S. influence remained unmistakable. It was visible in Liberia's flag, modeled after the American banner. It was written into the Constitution, shaped by American political thought. It was heard in the English spoken in Monrovia, taught in mission schools across the interior, and embedded in the nation's legal and educational systems. It was present in the economic ties that bound Liberia to global markets dominated by American power. But Liberia was never merely an extension of the United States. It was a country forged by struggle, by African Americans seeking dignity, by indigenous communities defending their traditions, and by leaders who believed that a black republic could stand strong in a world shaped by colonialism and inequality. Its independence was hard-won, its survival was hard-fought, and its identity was deeply meaningful not only to its citizens, but to the broader African diaspora. As the early 20th century unfolded, Liberia stood at a crossroads. It was an independent nation, navigating a world dominated by empires. It was a society divided by history yet bound together by hope. It was a symbol of possibility, as well as a reminder of the complexities of freedom. The legacy of US influence in Liberia was neither simple nor one-sided. It was a blend of support and control, inspiration and contradiction. It helped Liberia survive, but it also shaped the inequalities that the nation would one day struggle to overcome. Liberia's story, rooted in transatlantic journeys, cultural blending, and political ambition, was a testament to the enduring strength of those who believed in a free black republic. This chapter closes the story of Liberia's early years, but it opens the door to the nation it would become: proud, independent, resilient, and forever shaped by the hopes of those who crossed an ocean to build a home.